So, welcome. This is a panel looking at the topic of narrative in mega games and how you build a satisfying narrative in a mega game context for your players. I'm joined by three panelists with a lot of thoughts on the matter, so hopefully I won't need to do too much talking. So first we have Johan. Johan is actually a professional mega game designer, designing games for the Swedish hospitality industry, doing a mixture of sort of operational research and training through games, which I'm profoundly jealous of as a career choice. He's also the man behind Gothenburg Megagames, one of the main mega game network in Sweden, who've got a reputation for running sort of smooth professional games with a really high production value. And his own mega game design is Event Horizon, a creepy horror mega game with all sorts of messing with your mind involved. Johan, welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Next is Kyle T. Kyle is a prolific indie RPG designer. She's designed RPGs with topics as diverse as challenging the gods and becoming divine, all the way through to the secret lives of children's toys. She's got involved in the mega game scene more recently since they've gone online, but has done plenty of Model UN and equivalent things before that. Her first design credit was last year, the online game Dusk City, a game of secret vampires hiding out among a normal human population and trying to live their vampire lives in a safe and clandestine way. She's currently crowdfunding an indie RPG about divinity and sacrifice called Mariah, and I'm very excited to have her with us. Kyle, welcome.
Very nice to be here. Thanks for having me, Ed.
Thanks for joining. Finally, Alex is someone who's known to many of us. He's designed 3 mega games: Crisis in Elysium, the very intense game of insurgency and control set in a Martian megacity. He's designed Mirror Shades, which is one of my top 3 favorite games of all time, the epic cyberpunk em up type game, and also Monsterville Mansion, which is a heavily story-driven Halloween game. And he is the runner of the Horizon Mega Games network, based in central London. Welcome, Alex.
Hi, nice to be here.
So, without further ado, we're here to talk about how to build a good narrative or a good story in mega games. So I think where I'd like to start is just setting out some terms in the context of a mega game. What does a good story look like?
Shall I start? Go on.
Yeah,
so for me, it's the idea of having an overall kind of coherent plot of some kind. Now, that can have lots of meanings in different games, but the key part of it, there should then be individual player stories that kind of weave around and in and out of that. It might be parallel of it, it might be part of it, it might break off from it, but the idea that there's kind of a theme or a structure of some kind, and then the player stories weave around that.
Okay, so a central theme and a structure that allows players to build a story.
Which might be very different to a tabletop RPG where 4 or 5 of you make one story, but this is actually lots of different stories.
That makes perfect sense. Kyle, any further thoughts to add to that one, or any reaction?
I mostly agree. I think with the play by email mega games as well, the scope of that is expanded. Because in my experience as a player and doing a bit of the control for your sort of one-day mega game, it's, I guess, a little more hectic in terms of everything's kind of happening all at once. Whereas with play by email, you've got 8 weeks, so you can kind of slow burn stories. And there's a little, obviously there's still emphasis on like plot hooks and getting really into the thick of things, but you can also do more sort of subtle character work and having people interact more with non-player characters, which has been an interesting space.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
yeah, please.
yeah, I think I've been again, what Alex says gives a good sort of framework, and I think the framework is really important. I'm very into emerging narrative and having a world that you can understand, where you know what this sort of interaction points with that world is, so you can provide some sort of narrative tools for players is very important, so they don't go interacting with parts of the world that has no meaning for other players that they interact with. If start interacting with weird bits of the world that has no bearing on either the game or other players' experiences, that's not something you want. So you want that clearly explained. What is this game about, and how can I interact with the outcome of the game? So making sure player actions have impact on the story thread is important, and making sure that these story threads make some sort of sense together, not just separate. And a good story is only good if it's accepted by the players. So whether you have an idea of if it's your first mega game, especially if you have an idea what this is supposed to be about, and the players decide it's about something else, then don't try to coax the players back into sort of playing your game, because it's their game, it's their narrative, and point of view is very, very important. Players will only accept a story if they have agency over events. And so this point of view, both from the single player perspective, but also from other players, is very important for narrative.
Yeah, it's not easy to do, but it is, so important to let the players take the lead.
I mean, if you do nothing to set it up, you have no you have no control possibility, no levers, so to speak, in order to get anything moving in any direction, and then it's just a big mess.
So I'm hearing the need for a sort of a balance or a halfway house between having put things in place for people to react to, but not being so emotionally invested in those things that you sort of railroad them down a path.
I think I agree with that. I think broadly, I think there is also an element of, I don't know, kind of, you talk about in tabletop role-playing games a lot of sort of social contract between, the players and the games master. And I think that's true in mega games too. Players should buy into the theme, to their brief, to the plot and ideas of the game. So, if you're playing a sci-fi game, they shouldn't try and play, I don't know, trying to add elves and balls and make it into a fantasy game. So I think that there's a bit on both sides there. I think players and control make the story together.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that you need to set up from the get-go in order to have proper narrative and proper meaningful impactful actions by players on the narrative. Is what that social contract between players is important to establish as well. If Ed is playing a general and I'm playing a politician, I can't go round the room lecturing Ed on how to run the military game. I have to play as if he knows what he's doing, even if he's clearly not doing that. Yeah. And I have to play the part of somebody who knows absolutely nothing about what the military does.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Here's where things differ a little bit in terms of play by email mega games, just coming in out of that context, because you're not playing a role in the sense of you are a general, you are a professor, you're a scientist. You're playing a role in terms of you are a human being with like this kind of complexity of character and personality. So you can have that sort of argument that it sounds like you can't have because of the social contract of the one-day mega game, even where you can have disagreements over a person's choices and decisions because you believe that they did something incorrectly, because there's, I think, a little more character nuance. It's more about this clash of personalities rather than trying to fulfill a role that has been set, if that makes any sense.
So it's an interesting point, and I certainly agree that your longer term, freer form play by emails lean naturally into a sort of character-focused, character-driven narrative. But do we think there are ways to pull those aspects into a one-day mega game and have people play in a sort of more character-driven than role-driven way And I guess even is that a good thing or a desirable thing?
I think it's just desirable if that's what the designer wants. I've certainly tried to encourage it. I think certainly in the UK, I think there's been a challenge at times to do that in the player base, because the shut up and sit down videos and stuff often comes from a board gaming background. Now, some of those will also be role players and come in from that side, but some are just more interested in the mechanics and more a sit, more of a board game. And they don't always buy into the character and the role playing elements as much. So, I think it's something the designer has to actively try and encourage and reward.
Yeah, we are coming from a more of a LARPing perspective with our player base in the Scandinavian countries. I think what Kyle said is something that I sort of take for given, and that's why I don't mention it. You have the function, but you also have the sort of briefing on sort of personality traits or personal vendettas or relationships with other players, and if those things are there to facilitate telling a story. And if players ignore the social contract and start playing like whoever their best friend in real life is their best friend in game, even though they're mortal enemies, then that sort of breaks a lot of the power of the story and leaves most other players but really confused.
That's actually something interesting you mentioned, Johan, that the personal vendettas and relations are assigned, because that's, I think, less prevalent. You have people but the nature of the relationships, character, and personality are, for the most part, something that is designed in concert with control. So the player and players have, I think, a lot more liberty in designing the character that they bring into the game, the personality and kind of the approach.
Yeah, I certainly feel that I've seen a number of times that a vendetta that someone is briefed to have at the start of the game is never pursued with the same fervor as a vendetta that's evolved organically over the course of the game.
Well, you need to allow for both. I think that the sort of quick format of MegaGames needs you to, like you already said, Kyle, you need to take a few shortcuts. That doesn't mean that it's not a play. You don't have to conform and be railroaded by your brief. A good briefing needs to set out a starting point for your game rather than the rails, or whatever you want to call it, for the entire game. It's a starting point, and then the narrative needs to go wherever the players go. That is, at least for me, very important.
Yeah, so this is making a lot of sense. I think we've talked a lot about the desired outcome in terms of we want players to actively engage with the narrative. We want players to sort of tell their own stories. As a designer, what can you do? What can you put in place to make that as easy as possible for the players?
I think for me, there's a couple of areas that are really important. And we already touched on the brief, but I think it's kind of the whole setting that you're putting together in that pre-Paris and the Hamburg, kind of, gazetteer of the world, if necessary, Bruce. I think having lots of really key, interesting ideas they can play with. And again, what everyone's already been saying, really, that it should be a starting point. There should be lots of objectives in there, maybe half a dozen. And the player can then play with the ones that are interesting, but they should all kind of tie into that kind of narrative. And then I think in the actual kind of game itself, it's having things they can play with. And again, they're kind of optional drop-ins. They could be bits of a component, so interestingly named cards that they can then do things with. It could be pre-prepared plot bits you drop in, or it could be bits control come up with on the day, but just lots of little component story elements that can be thrown in, and then some players will grasp them, some players will ignore them, but it's just lots of little hooks that you can grab people with. For me, it's that kind of ideas, lots of hooks, not prescribed things.
So making the setting feel rich and detailed, not necessarily with a massive plot bible that every player has to read up front, but with lots of sort of elements within the game space and mechanical concepts that have like interesting names attached, and maybe even a bit of flavor text if you're feeling
Yeah, yeah. Flavor text is a great way to set a theme and give people ideas with very little effort to read.
What about you, Johan? Similar approach? Anything else that you do?
Yeah. I've got this. I really like the sort of asking the players to clarify or tell me what they think something is, rather than to tell them what it actually is. So that there could be some vagueness, and you can ask players to clarify that vagueness. You ask questions, you let them talk to other players and explain the narrative from their point of view, because it gives you as a control or plot control a lot of insight into where they think this is going, rather than where you think it should be going. And I think Alex has I think, if I remember correctly, in Mirror Shades, there's like an orange dot somewhere on one of the maps, which is there if you need it. And you can go, hey, look over there, that's maybe something, what's that orange dot? And the players can explain what that is. And if they have to do it by actively doing a run against that location in Mirror Shades. And then you can sort of start to entangle what that is. But you need to let the players in on what it might be, and then take them down the road of what could be. So basically encourage exploration of the game within the flavor text. And I think, again, back to one of Alex's games in Crisis in Elysium, there's a faction called Church of the True Martians, which is basically set up as an echo chamber of this. You ask the players, what's this bone that you found? And they're supposedly fanatics who are looking for something. And you should ask them, this thing, could it be what you're looking for? And then just let the players riff of that. And then that takes them down, always takes them down insane routes of what this bone is and what consequences that has for pre-human civilization on Mars. And you just go with it. Just let them go as far down that sort of rabbit hole as humanly possible. And then you feed them one extra bit of kit, and then they can spin off of that. That usually takes that faction into a very fun place.
Love it. So I guess, to what extent then would you be willing to let players just state facts about the game world and then make them real? Or is that not really what you're describing?
If that sounds like it could be real, then it should be. I think that's what I'm saying. If it's clearly not real, I would ask them to verify that with somebody who should know whether it's real or not. But I try to let players make that decision, rather than otherwise you get players coming out showing a card and saying, what's this? And expecting control to sort of play their narrative game for them. And that's very boring, in my opinion. I don't know how it's done in sort of longer campaign like what Kyle is doing. That would be interesting to hear.
So I would say that with a play by email mega game, though there is still some of that interplay, but you have, I think, to have a stronger foundation of these things are facts. Just because you're in this for 8 weeks, and if you keep kind of changing the logic of the way the world works around every time players think of something new, you're going to end up with a very, very strange sort of thing. For example, for Dust City, the players were vampires, so that required a very strict kind of rules. I couldn't I'm losing my train of thought. Basically, there were specific ground rules for how that worked. There were specific ground rules for like the antagonistic force. But obviously, certain things were pliable. Certain things were changed because of player actions. One nice thing in particular, which was baked in as a mechanic, was that you could bond with non-player characters. So the way that they acted and reacted not only to you, but to other people was impacted by the actions you took, but also how much you talked to them, and if you talked to them about things they liked, helped them with their problems, generally treated them as people. I think it's very much kind of what you were saying, which is you let people go down a rabbit hole, except instead of it being with artifacts, you're doing it with social relationships. So someone might gossip to you about somebody else, and you take that to be like, okay, so what is this person up to? And then you've suddenly got like a web of interconnected characters.
Yeah, that's I completely agree, but I think for a one-day mega game, you want to do that with interconnected events rather than relationships. But with the process and the mechanics, I completely agree with it.
Paddy's put another example in chat, which I really like. In his game Running Hot, there is a particular NPC called Case Anaclog, who's gained a great deal of notoriety over multiple runs, but in one run, apparently a player said, "We all know Case Anaclog is dead," which wasn't necessarily part of the setting guide at all, but the control team made the decision that, yeah, all right, fair enough, he is. And that NPC was suddenly dead. Which, I'm not going to lie, I would find a bit nerve-wracking to make that kind of call, but I can absolutely see how letting the players lead the narrative in that way just makes the story more satisfying for them, rather than having control jump up and say, no, it's not that all the time.
I have to say with that one, I for a game where I'm game control, I would 100% run with that. Where I'm doing plot control for Alex, which is a massive privilege to get to do, I would check with Alex and say, could it be possible that that character is dead? And Alex would probably say yes, but I want to run it by him rather than to completely break it, because then you get what you never want to have is contrasting narratives, where he's alive for 33% of the players and 67% of the players believe him to be dead.
Yeah, I think a big decision about shifting the narrative expectation is definitely game control, or at least discussion with game control.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's been one advantage of online mega games in general, I think, is that your control will normally have a text channel which tracks those sort of ongoing plot decisions. So the risk of one control team member being left in the dark is lower. But yes, I'm going to move on a bit. So we've been talking from a game designer perspective, which is obviously very relevant to all of us, but maybe not to such a wide group of people. If we flip to the player perspective, what advice do you have for a player at a mega game to make sure that they engage in a way that's enjoyable for them with the narrative and not just the mechanics of the game?
Just for me, a couple of things to throw in. I think read anything you've been given at the start, whether it's brief, setting information, because that is what the narrative is going to be. Be flexible, play with other players, do all the things we've been talking about. I think that requires player flexibility as well, to accept what other people are suggesting and bend to that. But I think really my number one thing is make sure the theme of the game is something they enjoy. I think I've done it as a player, where you sign up to a game because your friends are and it might be fun, but actually you've got no interest in the theme. You don't want to read the setting book. You're not going to engage the narrative at all, really, because it's not something that interests you. So yeah, make sure it's a game you want to play and a story you want to be part of, really. I think that'd be my number one thing. Yeah,
very sensible.
And I'd say because I would have said the exact same thing, but if you don't find the overall narrative interesting, find a part of it that you'd like to engage with. Or if your friends are playing, find some part of the narrative that involves them that you enjoy exploring. So find somewhere for yourself to attach yourself to the narrative, whether that's the whole game or a part of the game or a sub part of the game.
Makes perfect sense.
I mean, I absolutely agree with the other two. And I think just to give a small example, we had a player in Dust City. Dust City had a lot of political intrigue. It had a larger scope villain. There was a lot of drama going in and out of the city. this character literally ignored all of that in order to pursue a romantic relationship, and that's how they ended their game. 8 weeks, and they basically shut down every single attempt to get them into the larger story, but they were happy with it.
Yeah, I think if players are happy, then you've probably done the right job, right? So.
Exactly. That's all you really want for them.
Yeah, and I think this is not from a player perspective, but rather from a control perspective. If you see, like Kyle said, if you see players enjoying a chosen narrative, involve that narrative in the larger narrative in some way. Maybe this romantic relationship has some political repercussion or whatever, but rather than say, no, don't do that, or just leave them to it, try to move that into the larger scope.
Yeah. I do buy that, because a lot of the real visceral joy of mega games, for most people, I think, is the idea that there's this big interwoven story and you're both having your own narrative and contributing to a larger one. And so, yeah, letting someone completely bottle themselves off from the main sequence of events, sometimes it's the right way to play it, but usually it's good to be able to find a way to bring them back into that sort of broader overarching narrative that's going on. So yeah, any more thoughts on that one as a player? What can people do or not do to maximize their own?
I think we've touched on it a bit, but yeah, and so but the idea of being flexible, reaching out to control with ideas, obviously, if they say no or that's not going to work, don't push it. But I think, feeling free to contribute, I think, is a really important thing players can have.
I think like letting players build narrative relationships, or encouraging building narrative relationships, like Kyle said, maybe you start off as two generals, but then you're two feuding generals, or you're two romantically entangled generals, or whatever. Just encourage that, whatever that. And I say for not maybe from a player perspective again, but from a control perspective, if players are there to sort of it really irks me when players are there to sort of game the game. They're there to board game their way into a win, or whatever they want to. Let the narrative bite back if it's being ignored. If something's going on over here and they're engaging with mechanics over here, let that have a mechanical impact. It sort of bites back. UN Crisis in Watch the Skies is this sort of ideal. If left unchecked, that will come back and bite you in the ass sooner rather than later. And also, like from what Kyle said, if you have something emerging and players come to you with that, never let that narrative die at the hands of control. For you don't have time, or you just pass it on to another player or another control, or just mention it to a couple of people, and that makes it more that part of the narrative have more chances to survive during the game, because it's really discouraging for players to try to interact with the narrative just to be met by a not even a no, but a sure, absolutely, and then nothing impactful happens as a consequence of you having engaged with the game.
Yes.
Right. Just on a slightly different facet of positive experience of the narrative, one thing that I think does need to be emphasized, particularly with a longer form, is just having check-in with fellow players, asking them about their boundaries, because this is a game that kind of bleeds into your daily life and tensions get really high. So I think it is vital. It's absolutely vital, like after like a particularly incensing moment, or if there's feuding between your characters or there's drama, just check in with the other person out of character, ask them, how are you doing? Because everyone's just a player, just like you. Yeah, just look after each other.
Yeah, I think it's really important.
We say at the start of every mega game, make sure that you make the game fun for at least two other players. And if everyone does that, that's the sort of quick fix for doing what Kyle said, looking after each other and looking out for that. But also, I know a lot of mega game groups have sort of rules for how to interact with other players, making sure that conflicts are seen as in-game conflicts rather than something else. And Jim Warman was saying earlier to what do you do if a conflict is actually an actual conflict rather than an in-game conflict, then you need to break it up and calm things down and bring it back to a sort of in-game setting rather than a personal conflict, because that's never fun for anyone and can be I think it might even be more taxing in Kyle's setting over 8 weeks, but it's on par with having a almost a fist fight erupting at a game. That sort of it's not only bad for the two players who are about to engage in the fist fight, but the energy in the room becomes a bit after that.
For sure. I'm going to move us on to, or on a very related note, we try to avoid having absolute winners and losers in mega games. Everyone's sort of hopefully pursued a plot and had at least something they've achieved, but inevitably some people have a bad ending and some people have a good ending compared to their character. How do you make a bad ending as narratively satisfying as a good ending?
I think for me, you want to try and avoid everyone failing utterly. So having lots of objectives is a really good way to do that. Either ones that are briefed or ones that they can that emerge during the game, so they can at least achieve something. They maybe lost the election or lost the war, or all their resources were lost or whatever it might be, but they can still achieve something. I think then at least everyone's got a point of positivity to lean on. I think that's probably the key one as a designer I try and do.
I'd say if you have a terrible fate in a game, engage with the players as control and let them know what consequences their terrible fate had for others. Maybe you died, but you killed the baddie or saved the day, or you can also change perspective when you're down at the bottom of a pit. Then set it up as doomed to fail, and every other outcome will be a win, either from the start or where things start to go wrong. You can go back to the players and say, look, things are not going great. Everyone who is helping you is either dead or dying. You will be too, unless you put some real effort into getting out of this town or off this planet, or and then a new condition will be set and new expectations for success. I remember playing Red Dawn, Mega Game Maker's game, where we're playing the White Russians, and things were going really badly, and then controls changed the perspective to when are you getting out to all the White Russian players. You have loads of cash, but you have no troops. So we started shopping for houses in New York and looking at girlfriend options, basically. So that's changed the scope as well. And we were quite happy with sort of the bragging rights and of what we achieved on a personal level, even though we were utterly lost in the map game.
Yeah.
Nice.
Oh, sorry, were you going to speak up?
I was carry on.
I think it's a different story with play by email, because we have the luxury of writing out endings instead of having to say them at the end of a long day. Usually you'll give yourself a day or two extra writing space just so you can come up with something properly. We don't ask people to pivot, because by week 7 or 8, you know kind of what you're up to. You know what you're going to get into. So it's more a matter of making sure everyone's actions have an impact, whether they were nominally good or nominally bad. Some people die, but they contribute to taking down the big bad. Some people join the villain. We did have someone specifically turn dark side, but her actions had long-term complications for the rest of that world. We had some people choosing to flee the invasion, but we gave them happy or happy-ish endings because you're still people on the run. But it's kind of just finding the personal beats in everybody's story and making it more about their personal journey rather than necessarily the larger story overall. Like if their actions weren't as big a part of the big climactic ending, find what was important to them.
Yeah, I think that kind of, they're all similar ideas, and ultimately it comes down to both controls and also the player finding fun in failure, because failure and a fall can be still a fun story. There are plenty of narratives that are about fall rather than a rise. So I think it's accepting that mega games of all sorts are not about winning, they're about telling a fun story. And as long as I've certainly had some of the best games have been ones where I've utterly failed, but you can still have a lot of fun doing that. So I think it's approaching at it from both sides, in that actually, as long as there's a good story there, it doesn't matter if it's one about success or failure.
Yeah, I've set up Event Horizon as a sort of the doomed to fail from the start kind of scenario, where you might end up getting out alive as your best option, and that sort of creates space for this play to lose kind of concept. I find really interesting. But you have to explain that's the concept of the game. Otherwise, people rock up to the game thinking they're going to be big bad, alien killing astronauts, and they end up being in Event Horizon without knowing it.
Yeah.
And I guess it's one thing to sort of make a bad ending satisfying, and it sounds like a big part of that is always giving people stuff to shoot for, always sort of making sure players have had an impact. I guess the other sort of dread scenario is just the sort of bland ending, where players have just not really accomplished a great deal. And how do you, I guess, catch that coming, mitigate it, avoid it in a game?
Someone else got any? I think this is really hard. This one, I think it's one you can try and hope for, but again, having lots of hooks they can grab onto, they're interested in lots of objectives they can aim for. Control can keep an eye out for people who aren't doing anything much and are just sitting still during the day, and try and nudge them into some sort of narrative or plot thing they can play with. But I think it's quite hard. I don't have an immediate answer on this.
My only thing to work with is really ending the game at the right moment, which is also very, very hard, because you want to end it before you end the sort of, because every mega game becomes bland after a while, because either player exhausts all their energy and there's no more narrative fuel. If it start becoming bland, or it's a slippery slope of blandness, then maybe insert something into it and then end it immediately after the sort of right before the climax, actually, so you can have players play out the climax in their own sort of different versions of the climax. But that is really hard. If you have to have like good, your tentacles out and feel sort of what's going on with all the players, and if they're engaged or not. And if they're not, then go for a big boom and then end it just before the explosion. And if you're heading towards a peak, end it. Even if you're ending it half an hour or 45 minutes earlier than you thought you would, it's much better to end it before or right on the climax rather than in the aftermath.
So, as a game runner of a game that we couldn't end early, you really have to be mindful of pace. I think we have to, every mega game you have to prep extensively, but we have to be very, very mindful that there is enough to pad out the full running time and that everyone's fully involved, which I think is also why we tend to have so many non-player characters, because if people aren't hooking into the larger story hooks, sometimes they just get invested in the characters, which means at least they have something to hold on to. Again, I go back to my example of did not want to engage in politics, did not want to engage with the larger story, just wanted to engage with the romance and making music. And we're like, okay, you can do that for 8 weeks. Good for you. But in terms of trying to avoid a bland ending, it's really just checking in with players, because we have the advantage of being able to see everyone's email correspondence. So we know who's being active, who isn't, who's getting involved, who isn't. And we can act appropriately, whether it's a non-player character getting directly speaking to people who aren't involved, or kind of nudging their contacts, hey, you might want to work with this person on the thing that you're getting up to, just so everyone feels important and involved.
Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting advantage, I think, which why you can try and do that when everyone's in a room, particularly if it's a big game and it's hectic. It's not always easy to see who's actually fully involved in the game or involved in the narrative. So I think that's quite an interesting advantage of doing it online with email.
So we've got a couple of quite insightful comments coming in the chat, talking about how you should try, like, a way to avoid a bad ending is sort of to make it bad but. So Paddy's talking about an ending that's bad but funny. Your character may have ended up not achieving anything, but they've failed in a way that is humorous and still makes a good story to tell. Or Pete's suggesting bad but tragic, maybe slightly harder to pull off, but sort of they may not have achieved what they want, but it's not just you failed, go home. It's oh, there's some real pathos and some real meaning to what's happened. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I read the comments, and I immediately thought of a player we had for Event Horizon in the Swedish run, where he ended up dying a bit prematurely in the game, and he was not having the best of days up until that point, and that was sort of his, I might as well go home. But then we started bringing him back, but killing him in increasingly more tragic ways and involving other players in that death. And that became his reason for finishing the game, because he would just set himself up to die in horrific ways and then just respawning in the engine room time after time after time after time. So there's something to be said for doing that, but you have to check so that player is on board with that. Otherwise it becomes sort of borderline bullying, but he was absolutely on board for that. And taking a more absurd point of view, and we Event Horizon operates on B movie physics, so that was a perfect way to exploit that. And he was actually a big pain in the ass to the emerging baddies of the game. So just because he couldn't be killed.
I think it depends on theme a little bit as well. I think definitely Event Horizon probably, the series of funny deaths, it can work for that. Something like, I don't know, Crisis in Elysium probably isn't a game where you want people having funny death endings. It's not really what a sort of game is about. So yeah, I think it depends on the theme, but yeah, you can certainly do, whether it's but funny, but tragic, but whatever, then I think, yeah, that's just a really good idea.
Thanks, guys. One more question to go on my list. I'll just mention to chat, we will take some questions at the end. So if there's anything you want to ask, do stick it in there, either in the Q&A or just in the chat. But ending on a slightly lighter note, what's one narrative element you've never seen at a mega game but would really like to?
For me, it's one I've been trying to figure out. I'd love to see some sort of time travel mechanism that would be obviously primarily narrative. I don't know how that would work, whether it would be forward in time, backward in time, both. I have no idea. But that would be an amazing thing to see someone pull off.
I think you should talk to John Kay, because he apparently did something very interesting with his latest rendition of It's Not My Place to Say. Okay. I was told he did something fun with that.
I will speak to John because that's
yes, as will I. I actually have the same idea. I want to have half the game playing from one point in time and the other, and go one narrative going backwards, one going forwards, and then meeting where the game ends. That would be amazing. But also, I'm trying out some things for the director's cut of Event Horizon, where you expand the narrative to before and after the game in some way. I've got the sort of mechanics for it, but I don't want to spoil it now because we're going to run the game in spring this year. So hopefully that works out well. But it's building more, like Kyle said, allowing players to build inter-team relationships before the game actually starts, because that's one of the harder things, I think, to achieve in a mega game because of the restrictions in time. You rock up on the day and that's it.
In terms of mechanics, this is a little bit play by email specific, but I'd like to be able to toy around and give people a mystery of some sort, Rashomon style, where you've got so many people with different contrasting stories, and it's up to you to kind of like tease out the facts of what is the contradiction, what is the truth, kind of murder mystery style.
Interesting, yeah.
So you're talking about starting players off almost as unreliable narrators with their view of events, but secretly it's not entirely accurate?
Basically, they know what they've seen and experienced, but that's kind of colored by their own personalities.
Love it.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's tough.
There's some interesting things happening on the time traveling theme in the chat now.
Yeah.
I'm gonna copy and paste that into my secret document of time traveling.
So I was one of the players at Cataclysm. Fortunately for me, I was playing, well, I think both halves of the game were fun. I was in the past half of the game, so we had the comparatively simple problem of just reacting to the event as it panned out. I think John's efforts to keep the narrative consistent for the future half of the game ended up with giving him some fairly substantial headaches. So one half played through the Cataclysm, the other half were archaeologists investigating the fallout 3,000 years later. And so, yes, we weren't actually trying to make it impossible for him, but we certainly made it hard.
There's a question in the chat on when's the best time to end a mega game? What story beats should we be looking for? I think that's really interesting, and you should be looking for something where I think Watch the Skies is a good example, because it's relatable for almost everyone, because they've either said watch the video or play the game, but it ramps up to something where almost all teams are either aligned with or adverse to the aliens, and there's a big showdown. End it before the showdown. That's like the big thing, I think. So what you want to look for is active engagement from different players, and then you can do what Alex does for some of his games, just direct them to a point on the map where something is going down. We have the Thunderdome thing in Mirror Shades, where it's just something's about to go down, so let's move it into this area of the game and let everyone have a go at it, and just end it on before it's like you can start, but before the resolution of it, so people can sort of engage in the resolution.
And Johan, do you mind talking us through like the rationale for that? Because on one level, my instinctive reaction would be, surely you want players to play out the resolution.
I think that definitely. I mean, a lot of my games do have a built-in resolution, final turn mechanic. You know, the election in Mirror Shades, Monster had a big monster fight. So I think there's some narrative satisfying by having a resolution, I guess.
Yeah, but I think you can have that as you can have them. You need to end the game either on, or you can't have a turn after that big. because that if you have something that you as a designer might not perceive as the big resolution, but all the players have piled all their resources and energy into this thing, then you need to end it straight after that and go into debrief, because otherwise you have a turn of it's almost like a Japanese horror movie where the big bad thing is gone, and then the movie goes on for 20 minutes about nothing, and you sit on like half scared to death of what's about to happen, and nothing happens, and it's both satisfying but ultimately not.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think this is definitely important to have that finality, but for the play by email mega game, what we found is people are reluctant to let go of their characters.
Yeah.
So you tend to have a week afterwards of people doing epilogue and just interacting with each other. And that's kind of a prelude to the out of character debrief, just like help phase them out of the character mindset. I think that is important, just to like decompress from the big resolution.
Yeah. I think, and the in-person games, that tends to be in the pub afterwards, right? It's that kind of, we switch from the character and talk over what happened. But yeah, I can really see how that's important with an online game.
I guess the key insight I'm getting from this is that there's a moment in the game where past this point, a lot of the players will either have nothing to do or at least nothing of significance to do, and that's the point to cut it off. And the sort of the epilogue, the what would my character have done next, is deeply emotionally satisfying, but not necessarily I'm going to say ludically satisfying, and sound like a pretentious ass, but it's more fun to just talk about than it is to try and play out in the game framework.
Yeah, and I think also if you have this big climax and half of the players get wiped out, at least that's a good story. If their takeaway from the game is we had this big showdown, we got wiped out, 20 players stayed on to play the game and we pissed off to the pub, that's not a great...
Yeah. It's ending at that point of crescendo, isn't it?
Yeah.
You need to get rather than any time off.
Okay, so
ultimately, I think I just want to say there's this great quote that history is dictated by the winners, and if you want to have a good narrative, everyone needs to be a winner, because they can then dictate the history of the game, and you can have amazing after action reports even from players who objectively did very poorly out of sort of their game objectives, but as soon as you lose that, then you're into this territory of winners and losers, and that's bad for narrative-driven games.
100%. Okay. I'm not. If there's any more questions, you have a very short window to ask them in, people in the chat. Otherwise, we'll be decamping very soon to the pub channel on the Discord server. I know that Becky Ladley is doing a talk starting in the not too distant future, at 3:30 UK time, on making your mark with mega game marketing. But to close out here, so any final thoughts from you three on the topics we've discussed?
I think I've done mine already.
Yeah, nothing much to add really. Yeah, I think we covered it.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
I think it was super interesting to hear Kyle's perspective on because we tend to be stuck in our own universe and our own rules of running a 6-hour long game, and there's a bunch of really good learning points from Kyle's perspective. I think we all have at least to consider what would the impact of doing things a bit differently be. Mostly positive, I think.
Definitely. And it was really good just to hear from you guys because you're so experienced in the field. Like, I'm still very new to this, so it was nice to pick up all the lessons that you've gotten from running so many of these.
Yeah, I've certainly found that running mega games online has helped to frame key questions about running them in person and vice versa. There's some stuff will never translate, but some stuff that definitely, and I think the focus on narrative feels like it naturally comes out online when a lot more of your interactions are just person to person. The mechanics are maybe slightly more to remove from you, but actually that's something that I certainly want to be trying to preserve in an in-person mega game environment. So with that covered, a lot to digest, a lot of really valuable stuff. So massive thanks to all three of you. And yeah, we'll be calling it there. And as I say, no one is obligated, but I'd encourage you to head over to the MegaCon Discord server, jump in the pub channel, and I'm sure people will have more questions or comments or want to tell you that you got everything wrong, or yeah,
it's like a regular debrief then in the pub after.
Exactly. Excellent. Thank you very much, and yeah, cheers.